Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to give folks a minute or so to log on, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. We're just giving attendees another moment or so to log in, and then we'll get started in about another minute. All right, let's get going. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Leffler. I'm a senior manager for grid decarbonization and markets with the World Resources Institute Polsky Center for the Global Energy Transition. Welcome to our webinar today, Partnerships Plugged In, Regional Coalitions Advancing Energy Policy. Next slide, please. If this is your first WRI webinar, thanks for tuning in. We are a global, nonpartisan, research-based nonprofit organization working to improve people's lives, protect nature, and halt climate change. We have a team of over 2,200 staff in 13 offices around the world, working on topics like energy, water, forest, cities, food, and transportation. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, we'll briefly highlight what we covered in our previous webinar before transitioning to some opening remarks to provide a sense of how to leverage connections with other local governments into action and how to approach building a collective utility engagement strategy out of maybe previously informal partnerships. We'll hear perspectives from local governments and partners who can share their experiences related to the value that collective influence can have, and talk about lessons learned on the pathways, structures, and logistics or mechanics of working in a coalition. And we'll round out with some time for Q&A with our speakers before talking about kind of wrap up and next steps. Because of the number of participants, we will be using the Q&A function. So please drop those questions into the Q&A box. We'll endeavor to answer some of those as we go, and we'll address others in that Q&A segment. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is one of a series of webinars. It's the third in our series focused on local government participation in electricity sector decision-making. I think the links for the previous two webinars have been shared in the chat. We'll also include those in our follow-up information shared with everyone who registered. So our last webinar, Power Moves, Local Government Strategy for Utility and PUC Collaboration, looked at a framework for developing a utility engagement strategy. So we talked through some of the key steps and considerations, like identifying what those utility and PUC engagement opportunities are. For instance, say an integrated resource plan docket. Talked about aligning city goals with those different types of engagement opportunities, and talked about some of the key issues that guide a local government's consideration on whether and how to engage. We heard from staff at two local governments, the city of Missoula and the city of Flagstaff, about their experiences using these strategies in their work. So if we could go to the next slide. For our, looks like there we go. For our panel today, we are joined by Jacob Smith, who joined the Colorado Communities for Climate Action in 2017 and became their executive director in 2018. His professional experience is centered on climate and conservation advocacy in Colorado and around the country. Jacob lived in Washington, D.C. during a stint as a congressional staffer in the U.S. Senate, and has also served on the city council and as mayor of Golden, Colorado. We have Emily Quinton, who has served as Summit County's Sustainability Director since 2021, advancing policies and programs that support the county's environmental stewardship and climate goals. She collaborates with county staff, local governments, and community partners on clean energy, transportation electrification, sustainable development, and related initiatives. She also works with the health department to integrate climate into public health planning. And last but certainly not least, Tobin Freed, who became Durham City County Sustainability Manager in 2008 and transitioned to Durham County's Sustainability Manager in 2019. She supports county employees, businesses, and residents in adopting sustainable practices with a focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and strengthening community resilience. Now, before we dive in, if we could go to our next slide. We do some poll questions during our webinars to help us shape the content that we feature. We'll do two quick poll questions now and then two later, and we will share the results of these questions after the webinar. So it looks like you can see both questions now, although I think if we could go to the next slide. This has the second question. And so these two questions are helping us understand whether and the degree to which folks tuning in have worked in these sorts of coalitions. We'll give folks just a moment. And then let's go to our next slide. To set the stage for today's discussion, we'll hear some introductory remarks from Caitlin Rose, Policy Director for the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Glad to be here with you all. And thanks to the WRI team for having me here and for our really great panel. I'm excited for this discussion today. My name is Caitlin Rose. I'm the Policy Director, as Kelly mentioned, from the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network, or SSDN. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. I'm calling in from wonderful Asheville, North Carolina. So big plug to come visit Western NC if you haven't been here in a while. And I have been with SSDN for several years in a couple capacities on our policy team. For those of you who might not be familiar with SSDN, we are a network of over 140 now local governments around the Southeast United States, and even more individual participants in our network who are working collaboratively to advance sustainability and climate solutions in the Southeast, which, as you might imagine, is kind of a challenging environment to do that work a lot of the time. The Southeast is a little bit unique compared to some other areas of the country from the perspective of utility regulation. We do not have an RTO or an ISO down here in the Southeast, and a lot of our states are monopoly utility structures, so working with these large corporations like Duke Energy, Georgia Power, et cetera. These are the folks that are making a lot of these decisions at the state level. In the midst of challenging environments, local governments in the Southeast have been doing amazing work to establish long-term climate, clean energy, and sustainability goals for their own municipal and city and county operations, as well as for their communities. These goals are really ambitious, and our folks are working really hard to make that happen in their communities. But as they got down the rabbit hole of figuring out how to reduce their own emissions, make their buildings more efficient, install solar on their city and county owned facilities. Local governments realized pretty quickly that there were a lot of levers that could be pulled by state decision makers or the utility partners that they didn't have the control over within their own jurisdictions. So SSDN was started as sort of a peer-to-peer education network. Our members learn a ton from each other, given that oftentimes they're doing this work in isolation on their own within their city or county. Having peers in other local governments is sort of a foundational way that we help advance the field of sustainability in the Southeast. And a lot of our folks, as they establish these climate and energy goals for their communities, realized around the same time that, hey, we can't do this by ourselves. There's some other folks at the state level that we need to be engaging with in order to meet our 2030 climate targets, to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, and all kinds of other things in between. So SSDN and our members around the region kind of came together, I would say about 5 years ago, to sort of begin the process of developing what became our state policy program. where local governments realized that in addition to doing what was in their control, they needed to do things like engage with state decision makers, engage with the utility regulators, and engage with the utilities themselves to better have those decision makers understand what they needed in order to implement programs and meet their local goals. So I would say we've learned a lot from the work that we've helped support our members do. We've gone from seeing really no local governments engaging in public service commission or utilities commission proceedings several years back to seeing that being a regular practice of a lot of members across the region. I know Tobin is going to talk a lot about our work in North Carolina, so I will hold on that so you can hear from her directly about her experience and how that has worked here in North Carolina. But I did also want to lift up another example from our members in the state of Georgia. Back in 2021, several of those local governments had established renewable energy and climate action plans, or had adopted renewable energy and climate action plans that included utilities commission engagement as sort of a lever to pull to reach their own renewable energy targets. And that resulted in a coalition of 5 local governments from Georgia. That was Atlanta, Athens, Clarke County, Decatur, DeKalb County, and the city of Savannah, jointly intervening in Georgia Power's integrated resource plan back in 2022. And that was one of the first times that had happened in the state of Georgia. And as you might imagine, as I'm sure has been talked about on previous workshops in this webinar series, local governments have not traditionally been well represented at the Utilities Commission. It's a pretty opaque process. There's a lot of legalese that get spoken in that venue. It's hard to engage if you don't know how to do it. So to see this be a regular practice of local governments in the Southeast is pretty remarkable. Local governments also are pretty uniquely positioned as stakeholders at the Commission in that they are large energy users and large utility customers, but also are representatives of their communities and sort of community stewards of using taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively. So that kind of sets them apart from other traditional interveners in the Public Service Commission space. So that coalition of Georgia members is now, this is a regular practice for them to intervene in IRPs and rate cases in Georgia. Their presence in those proceedings has eked out pretty meaningful benefits that had they not participated in those proceedings, that would not have happened, or those things wouldn't have been included in the final orders that were issued by the Georgia Public Service Commission. So participation is really impactful at this level. And I would say just a couple best practices to highlight that I'm sure folks on the panel can speak more to in practice. But that baseline education is pretty important to make sure not just you all as staff of the local government, but that your decision makers and your leadership understand why and how this type of engagement is important. So I would say, in general, a best practice that SSDN likes to support is supporting that baseline capacity building and education early. So, you know, in concert with identifying that engagement opportunity, also identifying what things you need to learn more about, or what types of, or which decision makers within your structure need to know more about those things to make that happen. And then I would also say something we learned a lot from the Georgia engagement, as well as in North Carolina, is the importance of remaining coordinated and collaborative. So all of I will use Georgia as an example, the testimony that they file and the comments that they submit in Public Service Commission proceedings is all, you know, done on a consensus basis. So they work really hard to make sure that the information that they're doing research about and the things that they're sharing with public service commissioners reflects the views of all of those participants. And that's really helpful too when it comes time to, you know, figure out if you want to participate on certain levels or agree or disagree with certain points that come up in the within those proceedings. You kind of have done the groundwork to figure out what all of you value, what all of you are okay with or not okay with. So just sort of doing that due diligence to make sure you're staying coordinated throughout the entire process. That's something that we've learned a lot about, and I would say is a really great best practice. And maybe to round out my welcoming remarks and pass it off to the panel, who has a lot of really interesting information to share with y'all, I think the collective power of local governments who come together and coordinate on these types of this type of engagement really cannot be understated. I would say the commissioners in the states that local governments do frequently intervene and engage at the commission now expect to see the local governments participating. And this is a space, it's a public process and something that, you know, local governments can and should have a voice within. So I would say coordinating with peers as well as looking for resources like WRI or an SSDN or a similar type of network within your region to help support that type of engagement is always available. So I'll pause there. Happy to answer more questions later, but Kelly, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Next, we will hear from Jacob Smith, Executive Director of Colorado Communities for Climate Action. Over to you, Jacob.
Terrific. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. And I'm going to focus a little more on how our coalition is structured, how it operates. But I'm also happy if folks have questions to talk about examples of specific advocacy efforts. But it's very interesting to hear Caitlin's remarks, because I think our experience in Colorado is in many ways tracks to what you're describing in the Southeast. CC4CA is a coalition of local governments with 47 munis and counties across the state. We started with 6 and in 2016, and then have grown every year since then. We focus, really, it's a coalition that's focused on advocating for stronger climate policy at the state and federal level, mostly at the state level, but a little bit federal, depending on what the opportunities look like there. And that's true in the legislative arena. So we do a lot of work during the legislative session here. We do a lot of regulatory work, and the PUC here is one arena that we've done stuff in from the beginning a little, but the last couple of years we really leaned in and have intervened now in multiple proceedings. And I think that's paid off actually in similar ways to what Caitlin was describing. And then we do a lot of work with the governor's office and the state agencies themselves that might not be regulatory in nature, but programmatic or grant programs or whatever. And then yeah, a bunch of that regulatory work. And the federal side, occasionally where we think we can make a difference because there's some dynamic that involves a member of Colorado's delegation that we think we can influence that might play out in a meaningful way in DC. And that doesn't happen often, but it does happen on occasion, and it's paid off in big ways as well. I'd say fundamentally, we leverage and amplify the voices of local governments and local elected officials in these venues, and do it at the right time, in the right way, the right place, where those voices have a real impact. And elected officials just by nature have a gravitas and a political weight when they talk by virtue of the position. And in those settings, it's particularly pronounced. And that was part of the insight of the original jurisdictions that got together to form the coalition, that as an individual jurisdiction is really hard. Again, a theme that you've heard already this afternoon, that really hard as an individual jurisdiction to have an impact on those policy processes. Like at the legislature, if you're lucky, there's a single member on the committee that represents your jurisdiction that cares what you have to say, but nobody else will. Get a bunch of jurisdictions to speak together with one voice, and that dynamic changes a lot. And it was also true, the levers comment that I think Kelly made, that that was part of their recognition as well. A lot of the levers that limit the ability to do good work at the local level are at the state level. And so they just can't move the levers enough if they're not finding ways to active or to participate in effective ways at the state level. So all of that drove the formation of the coalition and has shaped, it's basically how we decide what we work on and the strategies that we deploy to make those things happen. I guess I'll say a little bit about how the coalition works, a few of the features, qualities of the coalition that seem important, that have been really important to us. They may, your mileage may vary, but they have played a big part in how we work and how we've been effective. So I want to flag them. One is that this is very much an organic, purpose-built coalition. This was created by local governments to represent local governments, advocate for local governments in these venues. And there's lots of ways to form coalitions and lots of models. And this is one particular one. And I would not argue that it's the best one or the only one, but there's something that's come out of that this wasn't somebody else that had a vision for a coalition. This was the local governments themselves. And so from the very beginning, the culture, the structure, the governance, all of those things were built in ways and grown in ways that tracked intimately to how local governments think and act. And I think that's had a lot to do with how we've been able to do the work that we do. our advocacy is governed by a policy statement, which is basically just a collection of policy positions. And to become a member of the coalition, your jurisdiction's elected body has to pass a resolution that expresses support for that policy statement. And so there's this alignment requirement on the front end, and that's the only real requirement to join the coalition. We have dues, but we make that work regardless. So it's really this political, clear evidence that there is political support for policy goals that are aligned with our goals. And then in exchange for that, every member has the ability to block consensus on a whole bunch of different kinds of decisions. So as long as to become a member, you've done this thing that demonstrates your alignment with our policy aims, then you can't get outvoted on most of the important decisions that we make. Things like, do we make any changes to that policy statement, or legislative positions that we might take? And in practice, it sounds like it shouldn't work, but it actually works extremely well. And that's partly because of, I think, our origins and the culture that's developed around this being fundamentally about for local governments. Every jurisdiction has a seat on the board. And so again, on paper, it sounds crazy. I have a 47-member board of directors, and that shouldn't work. And they all represent jurisdictions, which are their own complicated beasts. And then all of that added together, it really shouldn't work on paper. I've been doing EDs work for a long time, nonprofit work for a long time. And this is the most functional, effective board I've ever worked with. And again, I point back to that culture piece, the depth of the rapport and the respect and the sense of camaraderie really does drive how we're able to do the work that we are, even with these constraints around unanimous consent. And it also matters that around that table, the board table and the committee tables, it doesn't matter if your staff are elected, muni, county, the size of your jurisdiction. Every jurisdiction appoints whomever they want to serve on the board and serve on the committees. And each of those people have exactly the same role and authority and influence and power at that table. And that's not, I don't know that there's a lot of spaces where that's true. It's certainly in Colorado, that's uncommon. And I think that's also part of why the coalition works really well. Folks are able to cut across what are sometimes like protocol bounded lanes, and that opens up a lot of space for discussion, collaboration, shared learning, and all of that. And then lastly, we are fundamentally a coalition of local governments that's focused on, that advocates for stronger climate policy, as opposed to being a climate group or an environmental group. And that ends up mattering a lot for a few reasons. One is that it means that the positions that we take, they sometimes differ from where the enviros end up. And that's because local governments, as you all certainly know, have to actually implement a lot of the things that happen at state houses. And the entities that have to implement or deal with the repercussions of implementation often have a different perspective on how things are going to work and what will work and what won't. And so that means we could put those concerns at the forefront of our policy positions and our advocacy strategies. It's also consequential because it means in these venues, like say at the PUC or at the legislature, it means we kind of have a separate seat at that table. We're not getting bundled in with the enviros. We're just another environmental group, but we are actually the local governments. And that plays out because of the way the coalitions, the way the regulatory bodies like the PUC, I mean, it's very visible. You can see how they are thinking of the different stakeholder clusters, us local governments being one of those. And that ends up being really powerful because it means now there are often two of those stakeholder bundles at those tables that are advocating for very similar positions. And it's the same thing on the media side. We have our own separate voice. So it's like the reporter quotes the environmentalist and the local government person as different people. And that also helps drive and shape the stories and the outcomes. I think I'll stop there, but I'm more than happy to talk about examples. Maybe I'll just add one very small, quick example of how this stuff plays out. We often have disagreements among members on policy questions, not typically major ones, partly because of what we require to join, but like we've had legislation that would have big impacts on electric utilities across the state, but we have some of our members are are or have municipal utilities, and the muni utilities didn't want those legislative changes. They didn't want to be regulated by the PUC or whatever it was. And for us on the staff, our job is know the sensitivities, know where those concerns are. And we were able collectively with our members to carve out a nuanced position. In this case, it was a really simple nuanced position to just exclude munis from the legislation. But it enables, often we're able to come up with a legislative position or a policy position and advocate for it and actually get real gains out of that process, because we're able to figure out is there some kind of a nuanced position that we can get to that everybody can live with, which is ultimately the standard that we're using in our consent decision making. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer questions and appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Next, we will hear from Emily Quinton, the Summit County Sustainability Director.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm really happy to be able to share with you a bit about the work that we're doing here in Utah. I'm going to be focusing in on communities that are served by Rocky Mountain Power, which is a large investor-owned utility operating in Utah. They are part of PacifiCorp, who works across a 6-state system. And I'm going to tell you specifically about the Utah Renewable Communities, which is a group of 19 cities and counties pioneering a new clean energy program. But I'm going to take a step back to tell you a little bit about the story of 3 of those communities, Summit County, Park City, and Salt Lake City, who have been working together in kind of formal partnerships for over a decade now, helping to sort of lead us down the path of where we are today. So looking back many years ago, this was before my time joining. Our 3 communities, Summit County, Park City, and Salt Lake City, found that we had shared goals around clean energy, both in terms of the electricity that we're using within our government facilities and also wanting to make clean energy more widely available to all homes and businesses. And, for folks on the call that have been on some sort of clean energy journey, we know that there's sort of a menu of options for pursuing voluntary renewable energy projects, but there was a desire to understand what would actually be feasible within the political and cultural context in the state of Utah. So in 2016, our 3 communities entered into an agreement. It was called an Interlocal Program and Funding Agreement. It was executed by the legislative body for each of the communities. And this agreement basically set us out to co-fund, run an RFP, and select a contractor to do a study to help us narrow down from the menu of options for what we were going to do to start to have a vision for a pathway for pursuing renewable energy. And so that was one place where a partnership was formalized to go about this work. That kind of jointly funded project resulted in the team hiring a local consulting firm, Energy Strategies. Energy Strategies ultimately delivered 3 reports personalized to each community, but there were shared recommendations and findings across those 3 reports. And one of the really key findings that came out of that study in 2017 was a finding that community choice aggregation, which is a strategy that we were really interested in looking at states like California, was unlikely to be a feasible pathway here for us, and that instead pursuing some sort of kind of customized tariff through the utility was going to be a politically more feasible, but also more affordable option for pursuing clean energy at a community scale. So the communities took these recommendations and sought to, take the next step in saying, okay, well, we want to pursue something here, and we're going to need to work with the utility in order to do this. And so we also put in some agreements in place between each community and the utility. And so specific there, we put in place, each community had a joint clean energy cooperation statement with the utility. And then not relevant to the county, but relevant to Park City and Salt Lake City, they also looked at ways that they could leverage their franchise agreement with the utility to sort of set the expectation and set goals around working together on clean energy. So that was in kind of 2017-ish, where we had narrowed down sort of our options for what we wanted to pursue together and started to put the structure in place to partner both together and with the utility. on a legislative solution. I'm going to get back to that legislative solution because in the meantime, these three communities were also working together to look at using more clean energy for our government operations. So this coalition has worked both kind of on the community scale and the government operations scale. So couple of other projects that were kind of happening around the same time. The three communities worked together and with some advocates to intervene at the Public Service Commission. We intervened it in a 2017 docket regarding proposed changes to the utilities net metering program. So there was a proposal to move away from compensating folks at the full retail rate for exported excess generation and slashing that value. So the parties were interveners in that docket, pushing for a solution that was more advantageous to customers. And that, I think, was motivated both for thinking about the solar that we had installed to date on our own county facilities, but also all customers with rooftop solar within our communities. And then also parallel to that, thankfully motivated by large private customers within the state of Utah, the utility had gotten a essentially sort of like a green tariff structure put in place in years prior. And so Summit County, Park City, Salt Lake City formed a coalition with two ski resorts, Deer Valley and Vail Resorts operating as Park City Mountain Resorts, and one university, Utah Valley University, to form a coalition of 6 customers, 3 local governments, three other customers, to pursue one of these kind of offsite power purchase agreements through the utility. So an RFP was launched for that in 2018, and that ultimately led to the completion of an 80 megawatt solar facility called Electron Solar. That came online in 2024. So 6 years passed between the RFP for that resource and when it came online. And that is how these 6 customers are making progress on our goals to use clean energy for our internal operations. So I wanted to make sure to share, like, you know, this coalition work has been kind of happening on both fronts, both the community-wide scale for clean energy and also for our government operations. And in both contexts, it has required both coordination between communities, coordination with our utility, and coordination at the Public Service Commission. So I'm going to come back to kind of the community scale pathway that we followed. So I mentioned that we, you know, these 3 communities co-funded and ran a study. Based on the findings from that study, in 2019, we worked in partnership with the utility, Rocky Mountain Power, and former Representative Steve Handy to pass House Bill 411 in the state of Utah. It was called the Community Renewable Energy Act. It has since been changed to the Community Clean Energy Act due to a legislative change in 2024. But HB 411, or the Community Renewable Energy Act, ultimately what it did is it created a pathway for communities to work together with the utility to form a new community scale clean energy program. It did not specifically grant the program, but it gave the option for working together to create something new. And this bill actually did get some attention. It got some coverage in like Utility Dive, and I think it's something that other red states have taken a look at because it was a unique piece of legislation that was, you know, really attempted as a specific solution here in Utah, given our context. And so that was a huge win in 2019. But then there's been a ton of work to actually form the coalition, which we call Utah Renewable Communities, and work towards designing this program and ultimately work towards getting a program approved. So following the passage of the bill in 2019, communities came together to draft a governance agreement, basically to create the framework for coming together in a coalition to work on a program. So it took about a year for this governance agreement to be drafted. And in 2021, which is when I started in my position, it was ready for communities to start adopting and joining together as a coalition. So by the end of 2022, we had 18 communities that had adopted this governance agreement. And there was another legislative change that kind of impacted this that actually allowed us to bring on an additional community just last year. And so hence the 19 communities that we have together now. The 19 communities in this coalition It's really statewide, as north as Ogden and as south as Springdale. And it includes cities and counties and townships, anywhere from really small communities with like 300 full-time residents up to Salt Lake City and Ogden, which are our larger members. When communities joined this coalition, they did make a financial contribution so that we could have a budget as an agency to bring on outside legal and technical assistance. And per the Utah Community Renewable Energy Act, we also were obligated to reimburse the costs that our state regulators had bringing on consultants to evaluate our program. So that's part of what we had to co-fund. Each of the 19 communities appoints 1 or 2 board members, like a primary and an alternate who can vote if the primary is not there. That primary board member has to be an elected official. The alternate can be a member of staff. And we hold monthly board meetings and have been doing so since 2021. In terms of where we're at, because this is a very exciting time, we ended up approaching the Public Service Commission in 2 separate dockets. So the first docket that was opened and filed, the way that the act works is that Rocky Mountain Power ultimately files the dockets with the commission. So Rocky Mountain Power filed the first docket in November of last year, and that is a docket dealing with how we would solicit resources for our program. That was filed in November of 2024, and it was approved by the commission in May of 2025. We launched our RFP immediately afterwards. We received 14 qualifying bids for utility scale solar and wind projects. We narrowed that to 6 bids. And since then, the utility has been running those top bids through their system modeling. And we're just looking at the results of that this week, actually. The second docket is our full program application docket. So this was filed by Rocky Mountain Power at the Public Service Commission in 2 parts, in January and in June this year in 2025. And that is the much larger, much more kind of intense docket. So at that docket, we have Rocky Mountain Power, us, the Utah Renewable Communities. We are there as a party to that docket as well. There's also the Office of Consumer Services and the Division of Public Utilities. And then we also have some other nonprofit interveners in that docket. Since the filing of that program application, we've gone through submitting of our initial testimony, rebuttal, and surrebuttal testimony is due tomorrow. And then the big exciting thing that's coming up is that we have our hearing at the Public Service Commission on Tuesday next week, December 16th, technical hearing throughout the day and a public witness hearing in the evening. And so that is really going to be us submitting, the testimony that's been filed so far about how we believe this program should work, and to ultimately seek approval from the Public Service Commission. And as at a really high level, how this program would work would be that, communities would ultimately have one more decision point, whether or not they want to be in this final program. So following Public Service Commission approval, there'd be 90 days for each of these 19 communities to pass an ordinance to formally adopt the program. And then as a group of communities, we will solicit and choose resources that the utility would contract with. And customers would start to see a line item on their bill for those program resources. And the program has the potential to drive the development of hundreds of megawatts of new clean energy, if approved and if successful. A couple other things I wanted to just mention. So, Utah Renewable Communities, we're 19 communities. It's amazing to hear in Colorado about there being 46 communities. I think 19, it sounds like it would be really unwieldy, but it's also been just an incredible collaboration. And thanks to members stepping up at different times to fill different needs. Like, we work both kind of in the boring day-to-day of running our public board meetings, but we also have members who really want to get into the technical details and do that leading work in terms of the program design with our consultants. But we also have a lot of other stakeholders. So we have had clean energy and environmental advocates supporting this all the way through, from way back a decade ago, raising awareness of options for pursuing, community scale clean energy, to supporting the passage of the act in 2019, to following along in our docket process We've also had the opportunity to engage with our regulators, the Office of Consumer Services and Division of Public Utilities over the past few years to kind of share with them what we were thinking about for program design and sort of hear their concerns and make adjustments along the way. And obviously the utility themselves, Rocky Mountain Power, has been essential to this. We wouldn't be here without them. So I've got some other kind of reflections on this coalition work that I think I can share in the Q&A. I can just share it's been an absolute honor for me to get to be a part of this. I do serve as the secretary of the board and have been pretty deeply involved in the program design and plans for low-income assistance, which is part of this program. And it's been, an absolute adventure to get to be a part of it. And it's just fun that this webinar happens to be days before we have our hearing at the Public Service Commission. So hopefully there's going to be more exciting news to share in the future. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Emily. A reminder to folks to drop their questions into the Q&A box there. And next, we will hear from Tobin Freed, Durham County, North Carolina's Sustainability Manager.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the other panelists. It's so interesting to hear about all this work going on around the country. It's really exciting. So as Caitlin referenced, here in the South, we have a lot of different, situations that make it challenging for us to take control on our own and chart our own path. So North Carolina is what's called a Dillon's Rule state. I think of it as a mother may I state. So local governments really do not have a lot of authority to do things on our own. It's up to the legislature to give us that authority. Often, unfortunately, right now with the legislature that we have, even things that we could do before, they will take that away if they don't like it. So we do have to be pretty careful. For example, we can't set building codes or implement fees or taxes or use a lot of other tools. So local governments we've been meeting together through informal connections back as early as 2009, as there started to be more and more local governments in North Carolina. And then the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network was formed in the early, it was like 2011, 12, something like that. And Caitlin talked about that work throughout the Southeast, but then within each of the states, we kind of have a sub-network of ourselves. In fact, Caitlin and I are both up here in Asheville right now because we just had a state SSDN meeting, which was wonderful. And then we have another group that's called the Cities Initiative that's funded through the Environmental Defense Fund, specifically to bring local governments together to think about what state action has to happen in order for us to meet our greenhouse gas emissions and renewable energy goals. So there were sort of different ways that we were coming together, and really we're not engaging at the state in the state utilities commission processes at all prior to probably 2012 or 13. And we got involved actually with a docket related to data access. Duke Energy, that's our monopoly investor owned utility company here. Sometimes it's difficult to get data out of them. And so it was a docket that actually just got resolved a couple months ago. So it's been a really long time for that. That was our first time engaging. And at that time, there was, I think, only a handful of us who were willing to even get involved in that because it was so new to local governments to even step into this area. Eventually, though, around... let me see. So we really realized as we were working hard in our own communities on everything we could do to meet our goals, it really was not going to happen just on our own. And so primarily through SSDN, which now has 29 member governments in North Carolina. It's urban, rural, small, big, cities, counties, kind of covers from the coast area up into the mountains. We leveraged SSDN a lot. We also worked with WRI, our Rocky Mountain Institute, USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, NCSEA, which is the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. We started discussions in early 2020. about the upcoming Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP, and attended the Duke Energy Stakeholder Engagement webinar in April 2020, obviously virtually, and like really started to get in deep. It's a lot of information, as Caitlin says. It's super technical, and we really drew on these trusted partners to help us learn what the process is, what the value is, what our options were, help us kind of think through all that. We had to obviously do a lot of internal and external education. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then get approval to take action on this. So in some cases that was getting approval from elected boards. And in other cases, the city or county manager felt empowered to go ahead and sign on. We spoke meetings and eventually submitted comments in February of 2021 that included 11 local governments all signed on to one letter. And as other people have talked about, that's it's a process to get everyone to agree on to what all is going to go into one letter, and then to get all those approvals that all have different schedules and things like that. And even just to get all the signatures on one page was quite the effort. And then North Carolina adopted a law that created the requirement for Duke Energy to create a carbon plan that would chart out how they would achieve steep reductions by 2030 and then be carbon neutral by 2050. And so this was a new process, and we were like, okay, we got to get in on this. This is speaking our language. We got to get in on this. So we went through this process again. It was a brand new process. The carbon plan had never been done before, but a lot of the process itself was the same, but the topics were different. We had to learn a lot. Eventually, we did have 8 local governments sign on to that letter. We had a few other local governments who submitted comments separately from that letter, not necessarily because they didn't agree with the letter, but sometimes there was a little bit of the local government saying, we just want to be on record of having submitted something ourselves. And we had 3 local governments that did actual formal intervention, which is kind of the next step. Anyone can submit these comments, but to really be part of the formal record and be able to engage in the process through discovery and all those different things, you have to have formal intervention that involves lawyers. And the good thing for us is that really, as long as one local government was doing that, we didn't all have to do it. So we could kind of have them be our pathway through that more formal intervention. So that was great that they're willing to step up, and thankfully now their staff are familiar with this and willing to do this. So that's kind of thankfully been something they've continued to do. Another thing that we started doing was meeting regularly with the public staff. So the public staff who work for the Utilities Commission and are supposed to represent the customers. These were people who we really didn't have any interaction with at all, I would say, probably prior to 2020, something like that. And just having like regular quarterly calls with them, either about the carbon plan or the integrated resource plan, or about anything else like data access or new programs that are being proposed. Is really good to form those relationships with them and to make sure that they understand the local government perspective, because as others have mentioned, it's somewhat unique in some ways. So we're now in the 2024, they combined the carbon plan and the integrated resource plan. So now we have the wonderful acronym, the CPIRP, which is the carbon plan integrated resource plan. It's an acronym that has word plan in it twice for some wonderful reason. And for that one, we got 10 local governments to sign on to one letter, plus the local governments that formally intervened. And now we're working on the 2026, because this happens every 2 years. So now it's something we're more familiar with. Of course, there's always turnover in staff. There are new member governments that come along. We also have a new law that came on the books this past July, Senate Bill 266, which unfortunately took out the 2030 requirement for reducing carbon. And that is a big hit for us because we all have 2030 goals. So this is kind of a new thing we're working through, trying to figure out how do we talk about this differently? What are the other strong arguments to make if we're not having to make arguments about how to meet 2030 goals. We also have a new commission. It's more political than it was before. Have actually former legislators who are now on that commission. So that's going to be new to navigate for us. And then, of course, the mood around the room for everyone is different based on the changes at the federal level and how that's impacting Duke Energy's choices and what they're projecting. So in the coalition, as I mentioned, we used existing networks. We didn't have to recreate the wheel there, but we certainly have expanded those networks through this process, both with other local governments who have some interest in this process, as well as with these other nonprofit organizations who are helping us with this and with the Public Utilities Commission and things like that. We even had a mayor who was so excited about this. She went and spoke at the Metro Mayors Association and got other local governments excited about it. Working with the Association of County Commissioners, things like that. Not always necessarily formally working with them, but at least trying to educate them and make sure that they know that this is an issue that their members care about. But I would also say, don't necessarily think that don't think about expanding the coalition too far. It is very easy to expand so far that you then are not focused on that unique message of local governments. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in my lessons learned. There's a long lead time on education. This isn't something you're just gonna jump into as soon as things open up or you hear about it. We had to educate ourselves. We had to educate our legal teams. We had to educate our residents, our resident boards, like our Environmental Affairs Board, our management, our elected boards. There's a lot that goes into this to get everyone comfortable on what we want to say and how we're going to say it and if we're going to say it. And getting that outside help, again, was really, really crucial to that. And also make sure that those organizations that are helping are kind of diverse. So you're hearing different perspectives so that you can create your own authentic voice that is true to you and not just kind of taking sound points from other organizations or something like that. It's a really amazing opportunity to speak for local governments. As Caitlin mentioned, we're large customers ourselves, plus we represent our businesses, our residents, our communities. And we also are responsible for the impacts of climate change. So the resilience responsibilities, the adaptation responsibilities, those all fall at us in the immediate aftermath or situation of emergencies. I would also say we model engagement for others. So other organizations or groups that have not typically been involved in these processes have seen us do that as well. And we can help them along by giving them access to the education that we have and the resources we have to create their own letters or their own engagement. Also, other stakeholders refer to our comments. So when they're submitting their comments, they'll say, like the local governments care about this, we care about this too. And that's kind of cool. And then as Jacob mentioned, we aren't necessarily the best messengers for all the group's messages. And that really gets back to, being true to our point and not watering it down too much, but then giving those other organizations maybe the assistance they need to be able to participate themselves. And finally, I'll say, I think the biggest reasons why local governments maybe don't want to sign on to the letter or get engaged, one would be just they don't feel ready, prepared, like I don't know enough about this to sign on one way or another. And again, that education is really, really important. And the other reason is they don't want to come off as being antagonistic to our utility that we really have relationships with in lots of different ways. And I really think it's important that we realize that it's a public process that we have every right to be involved in. And I would even say we have a responsibility to be involved in. This is why these processes exist, so that voices can have a say in the things that really, really, really impact our business of being local governments, our communities, and our planet, and that we do have that responsibility. And we as local governments really deserve a seat at the table. We do have legitimate reason to be there. And as Caitlin mentioned, it's now expected where we are called upon in other ways throughout the state to be part of processes because they have seen us be effective and legitimate participants in these utility processes. So I'm going to stop at that. I know we're running a little close on time. If we have any time for questions.
All right, thank you. So now I think we do have one question that's coming from the audience. Although there are some answers being typed up. So question, what was the process of capacity building for local governments new to intervening? Was there funding and or training that was necessary? And I think that's for all of our panelists. Jacob did type a brief answer in the chat, but feel free to elaborate. But Emily and Tobin, if you have anything you'd like to address on that.
I did add a note to that, just to say that Salt Lake City, who is a really key member of the Utah Renewable Communities, has been able to do some work at the Public Service Commission independent of that effort, and they've been able to get budget to retain an energy-focused attorney who has a private practice to assist them with that. I think that they benefit from just an incredible teammate of theirs, Christopher Thomas, who has a background in doing work at the PSC from previous jobs. I would say in terms of other kind of capacity building, we've really sort of started with, okay, who is the community that does have the greatest comfort level, and kind of just doing like staff to staff training. So like in this case, I would lean on Salt Lake City to try to help me bring up to speed. I might discuss that with my county attorney's office to sort of have a conversation with them about whether or not we feel this is going to be advantageous to the county to get involved in that. So I do think our local government attorney's offices can play a role in that as well, just kind of helping to bounce back and forth, whether they feel like that's a good move for us to get involved. And I guess this might be unique to Summit County, but I have found that our attorney's office, even though they are local government attorneys, they have some knowledge of these different processes and governance structures in the state. So like they're aware of the PSC and they might have some things to say. So I think that has been a surprisingly good resource for us as well.
I should have made clear too, kind of like what Emily's describing in the answer I wrote in the Q&A. We do have a couple of members that do have deep expertise at the PUC. Boulder County and City of Boulder are the two probably with the most. And so they have, like Emily's describing, they have in-house capacity, technical and legal. So they end up carrying a lot of the load for the coalition, as well as the technical or attorneys that we bring in as a coalition itself. That makes a huge difference.
Thanks. One more quick question, and then we will need to move into our wrap up and final thoughts. But really quickly for Tobin, what was the return on investment for governments that intervene formally versus through public comments, given that the former is very time and resource intensive?
Caitlin, do you want to take that? I'm going to pass that one to Caitlin. My local government was not one that chose to do that. My quick answer is I think that they just felt strongly, their management and their communities, that they really engaged strongly in this, that it's so important. And they had staff who were willing to go that extra mile. But I'm going to ask Caitlin if she has a different answer to that.
Yeah, happy to chime in. Tobin, I think that's spot on with what I would say for the work we supported or the members we supported to do this work in Georgia. I would say our return on investment there was pretty high, just given that had they not brought forward some of the comments that they made, and I'm thinking specifically of the integrated resource plan that Georgia Power went through this year. There were a couple of details related to a solar plus storage pilot program that the local governments brought specific questions related to, and had they not participated at the level that they did, those changes would not have been made to that SPS pilot program. So there's pretty marked improvements to the programs that were proposed by the utility in that proceeding due to the participation of local governments. It is very expensive. Those local governments worked with outside legal counsel this go around, and that was a very pricey thing. So, just we're having to help them be strategic about how they make those decisions about how to invest and what to invest in when it comes to that type of engagement. And the public comment is a lighter lift in terms of, needing an attorney to sign off on it, the actual legal documentation. But the work we help support in North Carolina, I would say, is just as involved in terms of like the work that our members put into developing those comments. It's a really collaborative project and something that they're really focused on doing in the long run. So I would say both are valuable options. It just kind of depends on the time you have, the expertise in-house, and the financial resources, frankly, to make that happen.
All right, thank you so much. So huge thank you to Jacob, Emily, Tobin, and Caitlin for your insights and for your time. If we could move on to the next slide. So we do have a couple of more poll questions. We will keep these open as we move through the last few slides, since we are running just a teeny bit over. So if we could move to the next slide. And again, these questions will help us to shape the content that we're providing, to make sure that we're providing the information and tools that are most useful to you. So if we could go to the next slide. We will be resuming this webinar series in 2026, so keep an eye out. Next year, we're anticipating diving a little bit more deeply into some of the specific opportunities for local governments to make their voices heard. And we'll share information with you as those plans unfold. We could go to the next slide. We do want to highlight a webinar from one of our partners, the Duke University Nicholas Institute. They will be launching their power sector competitiveness dashboard tomorrow. And I think the registration information has been shared in the chat. I'll certainly be tuning in, but even if you can't make it, I highly recommend checking out the dashboard when it goes live tomorrow. It has a ton of great information, focused a little bit on the Southeast, but there's a lot of information that extends beyond the region about policies, programs, and structures that enable a more competitive electricity market. If we could go to the next slide. This webinar series is part of a broader project that WRI is doing to help local governments and communities engage in electricity sector decision-making. In the last year, we've met with 20 local governments, and we're using information from those conversations as well as from the polls and questions that we're getting during our webinars to shape the resources and educational materials and different opportunities that we are developing through that project. There's more to come. We'd be happy to have you involved. And if we could go to the next slide. We would love to hear your feedback and your questions. So you have my contact information here if you'd like to reach out. You can also sign up for our newsletter here. And next slide. So thank you for your time. We will be following up with some of those additional materials that I've highlighted throughout the webinar. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.